Most people either jump into learning Next.js without understanding React first, causing them to fail and have to start over, or they skip on learning Next.js altogether because they never think they are ready for it. Today, I am covering one of the most common questions beginners ask me. What React do I actually need to know before I start learning Next.js? React is the foundation of Next.js. And if you understand the right parts of React, learning Next.js becomes 10 times easier. So in today's video, I'm going to walk you through every React concept you need to understand before jumping into Next.js, with examples, explanations, and why it matters specifically for Next.js. Now, if you already have a website up and running, do you ever feel like your cloud platform is holding you back? Maybe you've hit limits on collaborators, run into surprise bills, or wasted time juggling multiple services just to get one app online. It is frustrating and it slows your entire team down. That's where today's sponsor, Sevala, comes in. It's an all-in-one platform with no artificial limits, unlimited collaborators, unlimited parallel builds, and no restrictive tiers, so your team can scale without worrying about paywalls. Sevala runs on Google Kubernetes Engine in 25 regions for world-class reliability. And with Cloudflare's 260 plus edge network, your static websites will load instantly anywhere around the world. Plus, it bundles everything you need under one roof. So you're gonna get managed databases, object storage, instant preview apps, advanced pipelines, all with usage-based pricing so that you only pay for what you actually use. And because Sevala is backed by Kinsta, you're gonna get enterprise-grade security and a real developer support when you need. So it's a great deal overall. I think you guys should stop fighting your platform and actually get to building. So if you want to use Sevala to deploy your application today, I recommend you guys trying it out by clicking the link in the description. Also, if you do that, you're gonna get $50 in free credit. So thank you so much, Sevala, for sponsoring this video. Highly recommend them, and let's get started. Okay, everyone. So to get started, I actually want to just really quickly show you guys how I am going to set up the project that we will be using in order to explain all the different examples and topics. So if you don't want to have that being hosted in your own computer, you can just go to an online ReactJS compiler. However, I will be creating a React project to explain the different topics. And if you want to do the same, you can either go into the description and just get the code with the final version of this project with everything explained, or you can just open up a folder inside of your computer and run the following command, npx create vite. What this will do is it will create a React application at an empty state where you can just do whatever you want with it. Now, this is not going to be a Next.js application. If you were to create a Next.js application, you would use a different command, such as the create next app command. But for plain React, you would use this. Now, it asks us for a project name. I'm just going to put a dot. Then we're going to choose a framework, which is React. We're going to choose JavaScript as the language. And then we're just going to run npm install and npm run dev. Now, if you were prompted, if this is the first time you're running this command and you were prompted with a question to install create vite, just press enter to continue. Now, when we install this, we can just run this and it should have our project running over here in the screen. Now, I opened up here the app.jsx, which is just one of the files that comes with the project, and I deleted everything that is inside of it, and I just left it with just this function called app that returns a div. Now you can see this reflects with it being an empty website. So the first thing I want to explain is actually going to start as very beginner, but this video escalates till the end. It takes you from very start up until a little bit more advanced topics. It's not supposed to be a full crash course, but rather a refresher of topics and or an accelerator if you really don't want to learn all of the core principles of React before going into Next.js. So we'll start off with the most basic thing, which is, so what is JSX? Well, JSX is a syntax extension for JavaScript that allows us to write code that looks a lot like HTML, but allows us to write that directly inside of a JavaScript file. That's what this .jsx extension here means. It means that in this file, we have JSX inside of it. But where is the JSX present here? Well, it exists in the return statement of this function. When we return a div, right now, it just looks like pure HTML. And it pretty much is. For example, I could add a button over here that says click me, just like you would in HTML. And if I were to click on this, it doesn't do anything, but it is a button. I could add any other type of HTML tags like this, and it will include those as well. However, there is one difference. The difference is that in JSX, you can directly insert JavaScript inside of the HTML. And that's the main benefit. For example, if I were to create here a variable called name, and I set it equal to Pedro, and then in this hello world, I wanted to instead say hello and insert the name of the user here. Now, I could obviously just show Pedro here and it would render the same thing. However, if I want to actually make a dynamic by using JavaScript variables, it is as easy as inserting this variable here. However, to insert JavaScript inside of the JSX-like structure, you do that by adding curly braces. And that tells JSX that you're about to insert some JavaScript. Inside of here, this isn't HTML anymore. This is JavaScript. So for example, I could write here anything, and you see that I get code completion because it knows that JavaScript exists inside of here. Now, what we want to do here is instead add the name of the variable so that it actually renders that value. Now you see, no matter what I do here, it shows hello Pedro, even though we removed the Pedro text from here. And not only that, but if I were to change this to something else, the UI would reflect to show that. So this is the basics of what JSX is. And when you learn NextJS, you will be using a JSX. That's just how NextJS is built, because NextJS is built on React and React is built on JSX. Now, the second topic that is extremely important to understand in order to move on in your NextJS journey is the whole concept of components. And React is built on components. Both JSX and components are the roots of React, and it's what you need to understand in order to look at a NextJS project and understand what you're looking at. Now, what are components? Well, components are functions, and the most basic component you'll ever see is the one that is on the screen right now. This is a component, but you might be wondering, why is this a component and what is a component? Well, this is a function just like any other function you would see in JavaScript. But like I said before, it returns JSX. So that's what a component is. A component is just a function that returns JSX. Now, why are components important? Well, there are a variety of reasons for it. One of the main reasons is that components are reusable. So we have this component over here, and this is what you're seeing on the screen. Anything I render here appears here. But for example, if I wanted to render my name, or render user, right? I could add here information about a user. I'll just add it real quick. So for example, if I wanted to render this 3 H1 tags over here, including information about a user, right? It includes a name, an age, and a gender. What if I want to show that multiple times for some reason? Well, I could just copy this entire thing and paste it multiple times. Now it appears 3 times, but this is a lot of code that is repeated. What we could do instead is we could just create another component, because just like how you can call a function inside of a function to abstract logic that you don't want to repeat, you can do the same with component, and that's the main benefit from it. I could create here a component, for example, let's call it user, because it's just displaying information about a user. And because this is a component, we need to return some JSX. So I'm going to return a div over here, and I'm going to paste that whole UI that we want to repeat. Now I can actually render this UI that exists inside of here by calling this user component inside of this app component. How do I do that? Well, most people think that it would be something like this because it is a function, but no, this technically is not the correct way to do it. The correct way to do it is instead to render a component by using this tag-like structure and putting the name of the component, just like this. So components are rendered as if they were an HTML tag. However, the name of a component has to always be capitalized. So you always make sure that the name of the component starts with a capital letter. Now, this is great. We can see the UI from this user component here. And if we want to repeat it, we can just do this. We can just repeat it 3 times and it will appear all 3 times. So this is great because if you understand components, you understand React. You understand how it improves the developer experience, because in JavaScript, this would be a lot harder. Now, the next thing you need to understand is how to make your components dynamic. Because, for example, if I want to render 3 users over here, most likely they're not going to be all the same user. So it's kind of redundant that I'm showing here, for example, the name, age, and gender being the same on all 3 of them. Why not instead make it such that this user component that renders this UI accepts some arguments to the function, so that whenever I call this user component, I can change whatever the name, the age, or the gender is for that user. This logic is called a prop. A prop is just an argument to a normal function, but instead of being in a normal function, a prop exists in a component. And how do props work? For example, if I want to make it such that whenever I call this user component, I need to pass the name into it. So name won't be hard-coded as we did over here. It won't just say Pedro. We can pass whatever we want whenever we call this component, and it will change the UI based on this. To do this, what I do is I go to the user component over here, and at the top, I open and close curly braces, and I define the name of that prop. So I'm going to call it name. Then I can render this name over here instead of the hard-coded name. Now, this means that because we're not passing anything, the name will become empty. But this allows us to then, whenever we call this user component, pass a name prop. So it's a bit different from how you would pass an argument to a function. In a component and a prop, you pass it by giving the name of the prop, which we defined here, setting it equal to a value. So if I were to pass here, for example, the name Pedro, it would make the first one say Pedro. Then I could pass the name, for example, Amanda, and the second one would have the name Amanda. And then on the third one, I can say Saul, and the name will be Saul. So we have a different name for all of them. And we can do the same thing with all the other variables. So for example, we could add the age prop, the gender prop, call them inside of this component, and then just pass a value that is different for both different props whenever we call the user component. And then you'll see that we have a range of different users with different information appearing in our screen. So why are components and props important for you to understand Next.js? Like I said, components are the core concept of React, and React is the basis of Next.js. So whenever you go to learn Next.js, what you're going to find is just a giant tree of components, and you're going to have to work with them in the same way you're working with them over here. You're going to have to work with props, you're going to have to work with defining components, and so on. So Next.js really requires that you understand what components are and how to make them dynamic through the usage of props. Now, there's a different type of component / prop that you will see it not that often in normal React, but you'll see it all the time in Next.js. And if you don't fully understand it right now, it's totally okay, but I will go over it so that you guys understand. And what this is what is known as a wrapper component. Now, what is a wrapper component? A wrapper component is a component that doesn't self-close. So you see over here, when we call the user component, right, that we created, we call the component, we opened a tag, and we closed it on itself. We didn't do this, for example. We didn't close with the user component. Why didn't we do this? Well, because the user component is not a wrapper component. Now, how do you define a wrapper component, and what is the use case of it? Well, for example, let's take a look at this component. So we created here a component called card, and we're just calling it simply down below. It doesn't even take any prompts or anything like that. In this component, we have some CSS that we inserted by using the style tag. Now, what did we make happen in this component? Well, we basically created a card-like structure where there is a border that is solid and is black, and we add some padding into it, which creates this little square in the screen, which is the card. Now we have some text inside of it. We just say hello, and I can keep changing this to say hello or whatever I want to put. Now, previously, if I wanted to make it such that whenever I want to make a card like this appear with a different text, we previously did something like this. We just created a prop called text, rendered it over here, and then we could just say, for example, the text is equal to hello world. And this works, but there's a different way you can do this. And that is through turning this component into a wrapper component. To turn a component into a wrapper component, you have to have a prop inside of it called children. Now, what is children? Basically, a wrapper component will wrap around some UI, and that UI that it will wrap around will be its children. So I know it's a bit confusing, but trust me, you'll get it. What happens is, when I call this component, I won't be passing this text over here, but instead I'll be wrapping this component around some UI, like an h1 tag that has a text like hello world. And whatever UI I put in between the opening and closing of this component, so in this case it's just this h1 tag, will become the children over here. So it's a different way to pass this prop. It's a special prop. Now I can just call this children inside of this component, and then whatever I put inside of here will appear here. And the good thing about this is that it allows me to put way more than just a piece of text. I could put here another piece of text, I could put a button, and all of this will exist inside of this wrapper component, because then I can just reuse it and the style will remain the same, but whatever I put inside of here will change. So this is the concept of what wrapper components are, but the importance to them in NextJS is actually a bit above the current level that you are if you don't know what wrapper components are. Basically, in NextJS, you're going to have what is known as layouts, which is basically a giant wrapper component that wraps around your the different pages in your project, so that you can apply some UI that will apply to all other pages. So it is important that you understand at least how this looks like, so that when you get to NextJS, you don't get confused when you see layouts. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is event handling in React. Now, this is going to be quick and simple, but it is important for you to understand so that you don't go into NextJS completely blindsided. So React events look a lot like HTML, but they behave a bit differently. So imagine you have this scenario where you have a form component that we are rendering the screen. You see, this form is pretty simple. It's just an input and a button. And that is reflected over here because we have a form tag that wraps around an input and a button. Now, we also have this function inside of here called handle submit. And if you're familiar with normal JavaScript, this is something you might see. You might see a handle submit function that is called when this form is submitted. Now, this function also accepts an argument, which is the event of the form event. Again, this is pretty much just how it would be in JavaScript. It's not unique to React, but I want to show you guys how you would go ahead and submit this form. To do it, you would pass an onSubmit to this form and call the handle submit function, just like this. Now, in the handle submit function, we need to first prevent default. Now, why do we need to do this? Well, when you submit a form, it is going to refresh your page. And in React, you don't want that to happen for most scenarios, unless you really want to for a specific reason. But in most scenarios, you don't want that to happen. You want the things to happen naturally. So we want to prevent default to prevent the form from refreshing the page. Now, what I want to do here is actually, I'm just going to alert a message saying submitted to represent that we submitted the form. And you'll see that when I do that, I do get that alerted message. So that's the simple way in which you would submit a form. Now, why does this matter for NextJS? Well, in NextJS, there's going to be a very important distinction that you need to make between two different types of components. One of them is going to be a client component, and the other one is going to be a server component. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about client and server components later on in this video. However, one of the things that differentiate them is the fact that in server components, you can't, for example, have an on click on a button. You can't have like an on change to an input. You can't have anything like that. If you want to submit a form, you have to do it this way, through an onSubmit, calling a handle submit function. This is just how it is. And when you get to creating forms in NextJS, you will see that this is the correct way to do it. Okay, so for the next topic, we're going to talk about lists and keys in React. This is important for a variety of reasons, because every website has lists and you need to understand how to render lists in a very easy way whenever you're building your Next.js project. Now in React, it actually makes it super simple because of JSX. Now imagine we have this example, which is an unordered list with a couple list items, right? I just put names of people over here, but imagine in a scenario, you might have actually double this amount. Obviously, hard coding the values doesn't make sense in a lot of situations. A great example of this is if you're building a website like Facebook, each post is an item in a list of all the posts that you want to show. So I doubt that in the code of Facebook, they have hard-coded each post that people are going to write. That doesn't even make sense. What happens instead is they request some data to get the list of posts, and then they loop through that list to render each post on the screen. So that's what we need to do over here. We need to have a list of, in this case, users, because that's what we have here. We have names of users, and we'll put each of the names over here. Now, what I want to do is I want to get this list over here called users, and I want to loop through each of them and create a list item for each item in this list. To do this, it's as simple as doing this. We need to use a JavaScript function for lists called the map function. So to loop through a list inside of your UI and render each item, you write the name of the lists just like this. You call the map function, and the map function allows you to create a callback function inside of here, which can return something. What we want to return is the UI that we want to show for each item in the list. So for each item in this list, we want to render a list item, just like this. Now, how do I show the name of the user as per what is on the list? So we have Pedro, Camila, John, and Saul. So to get each individual name, we can get the argument of this callback function, which includes the name of the user of the list that we're mapping through. So I can just render the list over here and it will show the name of the user. But also, because of how React organizes the rendering of the lists, you want to actually pass a key, so to the highest level element that is returned from this list. Now, does this do anything? Well, not really. It's not front facing, but it helps React organize your list better. Now, this key that you pass here has to be a unique value. So if you for some reason knew that all of the users had different names, you can just pass a user as the key. It has to be a string or a number, and this would work. But because you can't guarantee, most of the time, you want to just get the index of the item in the array. And you can get that by getting the second element in this map function. And this index will be a unique value because it's always changing depending on the element in the array. And you just pass this key. It won't have any front-facing changes, but it's important for you to do. Now, for the next topic, this is going to be huge for any project that you're building either in NextJS or in pure React, which is the concept of conditionally rendering some UI. Now, what does this mean? Well, when you have a Boolean, such as this over here, this is just a pure Boolean, so a true or false, but it could be a condition based on another type of input. Like it could be if an age number is bigger than some value or something like that, right? It just has to translate to true or false. In this case, we have this variable called isMarried that is set to false. And then we have this component that renders some UI. It renders a paragraph tag saying the user is not married, and then it renders another one saying the user is married. Now, what I want to do is I want to make sure that it only renders the correct paragraph tag depending on the value of this variable. So if the isMarried is set to false, it shouldn't show the second paragraph. It should only show the first one. If it's set to true, it should only show the second one and not the first one. How do you do that? Well, to do that, you need to use either conditional operators or ternary operators. Now, we'll start with just using an if statement inline inside of your UI. So if I only want to show this paragraph tag, if this is equal to true, and not show anything if it's equal to false, in a normal function, you would do something like this. If isMarried is equal to true, then do something, right? But in here, we need to do this inside of our UI, inside of our JSX. So to do this, we need to wrap this entire paragraph tag with curly braces, which indicates that we're going to insert some JavaScript in here. And the JavaScript we want to insert is the isMarried Boolean. And then we're going to say if isMarried is true, then do this. Then render this paragraph tag. To have that if statement kind of logic, we're going to put a double ampersand over here. And this basically stands for if this is true, then render this. So if it's false, it doesn't show anything, but if it's true, it shows the UI. So this is like if I was using a normal if statement. But if I want to use an if else statement, right? So only show this if it's true, but show something else if that's not true. What I need to do instead is utilize ternary operators. So I'm going to uncomment this, and I'm actually going to put the user is married
as the first one. And I'm going to wrap this entire thing around, not just one, the entire thing with the curly braces. Then right at the start, I'm going to ask, is the user married? And because this is an if else, the symbol that you put here is not the double ampersand, it's a question mark. So this basically says, if is married is true, then render this. Now to represent the else, you put a colon. And now it kind of reads like this. If is married is true, then render this, else render this. And you see now it shows the user is married. But if I were to set this to false, it would show the user is not married because that's the else case. Now it might look a bit weird if you're not familiar with this kind of syntax, but trust me, you're gonna get used to this and love this really quickly. And this is super useful for a variety of situations. Here are some examples. So for example, if you are building a NextJS project, you're going to be interacting with an API. So imagine you have a part of your project where you want to, make a request to find out what the email of the user logged in is, right? Maybe you want to find out their email for a variety of different reasons. In this situation, what you would want to do is fetch this data, which is going to be the user email, and then assign it to a variable, such as data. Now, there's a small gap in time in between you requesting the data and you getting it back. Now, if you want to show that data in the screen, for example, in here, we are showing the user email is, and then whatever that is, then you need to make sure that the data is there first. Because in this example here, we have this variable called data, and it's set to this email. But before we are able to make the request and get that back the email, this will be null because there won't be any data, right? Because there's a small gap in time. So while that's true, it will show this weird empty state. It will show user email is blanked, or in a lot of scenarios, it will break your entire app. So what you need to do is you need to handle what the UI will show while the data is loading. So usually you have this variable called is loading. And when you get to NextJS, you'll see how to actually implement it such that it only sets to true while you're fetching the data. And then when you get the data back, it will revert to false. But this is a clear example of how you would see ternary operators being used. You would have an is loading condition that shows something like this so that it doesn't show a broken state before the data comes back. And then when is loading is set to false, then it shows the complete data with the name of the user. Perfect. So this is why conditional rendering and ternary operators are super important in Next.js.
Now let's look at this following example. So we have here a component called dropdown. And in this component, which we're calling down here, all we're doing is we have this logic where we have a button called show dropdown. And when we click on it, I want to display the UI that we have over here, which is this UI over here. This is the dropdown that I want to display. Right now we have this Boolean called open, which is set to true, and that's why the dropdown is showing. But if I were to set this to false, this dropdown wouldn't show. Now, why are we doing that? Because I want to show you guys how to make it such that when I click on this button, it will change open to true and or to false if it's already true, and make the UI update whenever that happens. Now let's think about how we would go ahead and do this. Well, we have this button over here. If I write on click on this button, we can run some function that will only run whenever the user clicks on this button. So one of the things I can do is I can make this function here and basically set open to be equal to true, right? And I can make this function look a bit more like a function, just like this. I can set it equal to true. And you would imagine that when I were to click this button, it would actually show the new opened dropdown. Because when I click on this, open is true, and when it's true, it shows the dropdown. But look what happens. Nothing. Now, you might be wondering, so is open equal to true? Well, let's check it out. Now, I can console log this. I'll console.log open, and I'm going to see over here if it's equal to true. So I'm going to console log it. Also, I'm going to update this from a constant to a let, because a constant you can't change. And let's click on this. As you can see, it is set to true. But if I were to basically set it to be the opposite of what it is right now, which just means that if it's false, it becomes true. And if it's true, it becomes false. What you should see is that initially it should become true, but then it becomes false, then true, then false, then true, then false. So it is actually updating the value of open. But why is the UI not showing that change? Well, the reason for that is because even though this variable that we're using on our UI
called open is changing its value, we're never letting React know to update and re-render this page or re-render this component to show the new updated state. The way you do this is you need to somehow manage the state of the UI. And to do that, you can create what is known as a state. Now, that's one of the most important concepts in React, together with all the stuff that we've talked about so far, but this one is really the game changer. This a state basically is a variable that when its value changes, it will re-render the UI or the page to match the new version of that UI that will apply the new value of the variable. So in this example, we're going to create this state called open. So to create a state, you say const, you open and close square brackets just like this, and then you set it equal to the use state hook. Now inside of here, we want to create a variable called open, just like we had before. Now with states, you also need to create a function that is going to be used to change the value of that state. So with a state, I couldn't just say, for example, open is equal to true. I have to use this function or else it won't work. Instead of to set it to true, I have to say set open true, and then it will make it true, or set open false, and then it will make it false. I can't just set this and mutate this value. Now, because this is a Boolean, we need to pass an initial value, which before it was set to false. Now, to pass an initial value to this open state, we pass it inside of here. So if this is a Boolean, the initial value is false. Sometimes if this is a string, if the state you're creating is a string, you would just put an empty string. Now we'll keep it as false, and we want to now be able to click on this button and toggle it, meaning we set it to be equal to the opposite of what it is right now. So if it's false, it becomes true. If it's true, it becomes false. Now this is what we're doing over here. But again, to alter the value of open, we need to use this function and not do it this way. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to set open to be equal to the opposite of what open is. And because open is not just a normal variable, open is a state that utilizes this function, which is a hook called use state, it will now update the UI to show the new value of the state every time I click on this button. Because when I change the open state, it will re-render the component and run this check again to see if open is true or false, thus changing how we see it. Now, states are super important in React itself. Now, with NextJS, they are important as well, but a little less important because of the differences in how React and NextJS like to render their components. So with NextJS, we have, like I mentioned before, something called a server component. And it is preferable that most of your app is actually inside of a server component. And things like states won't work inside of there. So that's why I wanted to introduce all of these topics so that now I can get into some more Next.js specific topics. Now we're almost done. This is the last thing I want to talk about, because this is a little bit more Next.js specific rather than React itself, but it is also part of React, which is what we've been working towards, distinguishing between what a client component is and what a server component is. Now, when you go ahead and start creating your Next.js applications, every component by default is going to be a server component. And every component that we've created so far in this project has been client components, because server components don't work in normal React.js apps. So if you're going to learn Next.js, you need to know that normal React uses client components, and Next.js or server-side rendered frameworks like Next.js uses server components. Now, what is the difference? Well, a server component runs completely on the server. So that means that it has direct connection with the server. You can fetch data directly from the server without having to, for example, wait for that to happen or use any other extension to do that. You can just make your component function become an async component, which this won't work if this is a client component, but if this was a server component, we can just do that. And then if you want to fetch data, you can just directly here await and fetch some data. So you could do this in a server component. Also, there's no bundle set to the client. That means that when the user enters the page, it's going to download the HTML from the server and render the page.
There's no JavaScript that it needs to download first, which is exactly what happens in React, in a client-side rendered React app like we have right now, which is good and bad in some ways. The good thing is that because it doesn't have a bunch of JavaScript it needs to download when you enter the page, it is faster to load. Also, search engine web crawlers from like Google and other search engines, they can read your page better if your component is server-side rendered. So it's better for SEO. But there's some negatives to that. You cannot use some of the things that we've learned so far. So when we learned about the use state hook, we learned about how useful it is to like manage the UI in our application and other stuff like that. You can't use that in a server component. So when you learn NextJS, you're gonna have to learn when to make a component be server and when to make a component be client. There are other hooks in React that I didn't think were important to include in this video because they're not required for you to know before you get to NextJS. I feel like you can learn as you're learning the other Next.js topics as well. An example of that would be the use effect hook. Any hook in React, you can only use in a client component, not in a server component. And like I said, it's the default one in Next.js, meaning that whenever you create a component, even if it's not asynchronous, which is what we did over here to fetch data, it's going to be a server component by default, no matter what. So you have to tell Next.js to make your component be a client component in order to do this stuff, for example, create states and other stuff. For example, interactivity. When you have a button, right? You have a button like this, click me, and you want to do something on an on click. This kind of event handling from the user, so browser interactivity, can only happen in client components. You can't do that in server components. So if I wanted to make this component be client in Next.js, you'll have to add a use client at the top of your file. Now, this doesn't work in normal React projects like we have over here. That's why I'm leaving this topic to the last. This is when you get to Next.js, you'll have to do this. And this will turn your entire component or entire file into a client-side rendered component. And like I said, you're gonna want to use client components for basically all the situations in which you can't use a server component for. So that's the mentality you need to have. You're gonna have the mentality of making your whole project be server-side rendered, and whenever you want to do something that you can't do in a server component, you'll create another component that is client and does that kind of thing. So that's basically it. This is all of the React that I recommend you understand before you start learning Next.js. At this point, I think you're ready to go ahead and create your first Next.js project. If you want to learn Next.js from beginner to advanced, I have a course that I have released in the past 3 months, and I spent a year working on this course, and I've received incredible feedback from a bunch of you guys. So if you want to learn Next.js through real projects and real examples, learn not only how to create websites, but how to maintain them, how to produce good quality code, I recommend checking out my course. You can just go to webdevultra.com/nextjs or just click the link in the description. If instead you want to learn React, I have countless courses on my YouTube channel, or if you want to, again, get a more in-depth view of it with a more structured kind of curriculum, I also have my ReactJS course, which I released a year ago as well, and it's fully updated up to the latest version of React. It's in the description as well if you want to check it out. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Again, thank you so much Cevala for sponsoring this video, so I recommend you guys checking them out. And again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I see you guys next time.